Okay, I don't feel like prefacing these videos by saying that they're unscripted all the time, so instead I'm just gonna have some title card at the beginning that just says Based Gaming, and you will know that when we enter the Based Gaming zone, we are in the unscripted zone. Why, you may ask? I don't know, and I don't really care. I just want to get into the topic. Cvit's Persona 5 video lives in my head rent-free. It really challenged my view of long videos as a review format on YouTube. And this is because the video itself was not very good, but the ways in which it wasn't good were so fascinating to me because all of the issues that came up with how he formatted his video are things that I have run into multiple times in Dangan Chronicles. And through understanding why these problems that were in his video came about, you can kind of easily see a lot of problems with how the 1 hour long to 2 hour long review format is on this site. But before we get into all of that, let me catch everyone up to speed who is not familiar with what I'm talking about. So a while back, Cvit released this video called Persona 5 Style Over Substance. It was a almost 5 hour long review of Persona 5 where the main thesis was that despite the game's good presentation, the actual game itself was substanceless. To back up this argument, he decided to go through a bunch of very minute details about the game, including everything to do with the story, the gameplay, and the side content. Now, for the uninformed, this may sound kind of normal, right? Like, it's kind of hard to see where things went wrong, besides having the video be 5 hours, because the assumption would just be that, well, maybe the video was too long, but at least maybe it was long because it had a lot of arguments to make. Maybe the problems with Persona 5 were just so in-depth that he needed to spend that much time talking about them. And honestly, if the problem actually was that the video was just slightly too long but actually made good arguments, then that probably would have been a better problem to have than what the video actually ended up being. See, in reality, Cvit's video is not only just bloated with large amounts of summaries about the game, but it's also filled with shit tons of misinformation, misunderstanding about how the game actually works. It's also filled with a ton of misquotes from the story. He also will sometimes go after details that really don't make the argument that the game is substanceless all that clear. Like, sometimes his actual thesis gets lost because he'll just go down this rabbit hole of just attacking this random detail about the game for what feels like no reason. Like, to put it into perspective for you, I am not a Persona fan. I did not enjoy Persona 5, but even I realized that there were a shit ton of problems with this video. I'm not going to go through the specifics of everything he got wrong here because I think there are already some good videos out there that already do that, but what I'm here to do is to point out that a lot of these problems that he had are not necessarily exclusive to him and him alone. In fact, I'm willing to argue that a lot of the issues that he ran into that I just mentioned are ones that you're more likely to run into if you make videos in the same format. To get things off of shitting on Cvit, I know in my DR videos that I even ran into a lot of issues with misinformation near the beginning of the series, and I also ended up focusing on minute details that didn't feel all that relevant to the overall points I was making. And in realizing the similarities between Persona 5 Style Over Substance and my own work, I started to become more aware of problems that were also shared by other videos in the same genre. So this brings me to my first point about how this feature-length review format actually lends itself to a lot of these problems happening. There's a weird trend with this video format where whatever is being reviewed is reviewed on a very specific set of criteria. So let's take your average game review, right? A pretty common trend for mainstream reviewers is to divide the game into sections. So what they usually do is rate it on things like how its gameplay was, how its story was, and how something like its music was. Usually it could be something else, but I'm just going with music for the sake of this example. Now, the feature-length reviewer in these hour-long reviews co-ops this format, but kind of stretches it out to a much larger scale. A lot of times in these short, maybe 5 to 10 minute reviews you'd expect to see from something like IGN, they probably won't go into too much detail about what they thought and why. With the feature-length reviewer, however, they really take advantage of their lack of time constraints to go into detail about what they thought for each section. Now, on its own, this is fine, but where this can start to become a bit shaky is when you introduce this idea that some of these reviewers tend to have, and I know I at least ran into this problem, where you sort of feel pressured to talk about more than you would need to otherwise. And a lot of this stems from how this format has evolved since people like Red Letter Media came out with those Star Wars reviews. reviews. Generally speaking, there seems to be this prevailing thought that if you are more thorough, your points are better. Like if I'm trying to convince you that a game is bad, I would theoretically be more convincing if I had more examples than if I just was vague and said I really didn't like this thing. So what'll end up happening is you'll have a lot of these videos centered around trying to fill out these sections that were arbitrarily decided to be the criteria by which we judge whether or not media is good or bad, with the overall underlying assumption being that whatever we're looking at is the sum of its parts. So if we can demonstrate that all of its parts are failing, then we can demonstrate that the whole, the actual thing itself, is failing. Now I hope that you can start to see where a lot of these issues with misinformation and dwelling on points that don't seem all that relevant come from. It all stems from this attempt at trying to gain as much legitimacy for your arguments as possible. And this extends into another point I want to talk about, which is the idea of having legitimacy at all. Now what do I mean by this? The thing about YouTube is that anyone who has a mic and video editing software basically has the capacity to contribute on the same level as a larger media outlet. If you want to make a video talking about a movie, you don't have to end up on some weird movie site. You don't have to be employed by some movie reviewing agency or whatever. You could just turn on your camera and talk about it. Everyone's voice is equal. But the downside to this is that if you do choose to go on this path, then you must deal with the fact that everyone's voice is equal. If everyone has the same capacity to contribute their opinion on something, then what makes your opinion more valuable or worth listening to over anyone else? Now obviously this does seem weird at first because like why should anyone's opinion really matter more than anyone else's when you're talking about like a fucking movie or video game or something? But to ground things a bit, this is kinda how YouTube works in general. To not get into things too much, this whole website is just a bunch of people running different channels who are basically competing with each other to gain your viewership. And that's not to say that they are intentionally doing it to spite each other or they are trying to screw over one another to get up higher on the YouTube ladder. But at the end of the day, it's the YouTube algorithm that decides whether or not your video gets shown to other people. And if it wasn't your video, it was going to be someone else's. So on some level, there is a struggle between creators, whether they feel strongly about each other or not. And unfortunately, this extends into the reviewer scene. On some base level, people who are actively uploading to YouTube all their reviews or whatever are doing so with the intention of having them be seen by other people. And unfortunately, people who are looking to get into this community who make these feature-length video essays will have to deal with this at some point. They will have to, through their content, indirectly provide a reason for people to actually take their reviews seriously. And a byproduct of this is the issue I mentioned earlier where there is this sort of unnecessary fight for legitimacy. And this is my theory as to why with a lot of these videos you'll see a lot of long diatribes about good game design or consistent story structure or character development. Like in my DR videos, I have a lot of rants talking about things like the characters and how you can structure your story based on these two different schematics that I pulled out of my ass for one section. There are a lot of points where I would speak in terms of things like story and gameplay. I would talk about things like evidence structure. I would talk about things like mystery structure. I would talk about different story elements and provide long explanations as to why I don't think they work or something like that. And this all isn't inherently bad, but the purpose of it is to make you think that I know what I'm talking about. But the problem at the heart of this is that I am no authority on any of these things that I'm talking about, and that could result in me overextending what I think is or isn't a good idea narrative wise, even though it very well may be. I'm just too close-minded to really see beyond that. And that can create a lot of problems in something like a game review if I'm not willing to look beyond an extremely rigid set of rules I've set for determining media's quality, while criticizing something that may have actually worked had I not approached my analysis from that viewpoint. And if you factor all of this in with what I mentioned earlier about the rigid criteria in the previous point, you can really start to see where a lot of these other problems that I didn't specifically cover come from. Like for example, it's pretty obvious to me why there's a lot of summary in the videos. It's because the reviewer wants to be thorough, because they want to make a solid argument, because they want to have a legitimate point. And based on the viewership and the way this genre has progressed up until now, the way they are going about it is the way that appears to be the most effective means to accomplish this, even though it very well might not be. You can even see this with the trend of quote-unquote objective reviews that got perpetuated by people like Rags and Mahler. If a review is objective and it's thorough, then therefore the person giving it appears more reliable as a result. Now, all that being said, I don't think everything I just went over can be applied to every single review that happens to be feature length. There are definitely people out there who just make this type of content because they have a lot to say and they just like to talk about things in this way. But this does definitely cover one specific type of reviewing content that's very relevant to me and very relevant to Cvit's video. And I do think it's important to keep aware about the stylistic decisions made during some of these videos, to at least be wary about when certain things are being said. Like when a YouTuber is talking about things like good character development or basic storytelling, it's important to at least step back once in a while and question why this type of thing is being said. Like, why did they choose to phrase it in this way, and does that actually apply to what they're talking about? It's also important to keep in mind that despite how confident the reviewer may sound, it really is just their opinion on things, and it really shouldn't be taken more as just another perspective to consider should you choose to reevaluate what you think about whatever they're talking about. Or you could go the base route and be like Cvit, where you spend like 5 minutes or so complaining about some bread.
In the school's cafeteria, you can buy a variety of breads, as well as yakisoba pan. Since these items are right next to each other, most people would probably assume that yakisoba pan is a pan that you could cook yakisoba in. But actually, pan is just bread in Japanese. And even though the game has fried bread and jam bread on the same menu, they couldn't be bothered to write out yakisoba bread.